Welcome to Level Up, the show where current affairs gets context. I'm Phumi Mashigo, and today we are unpacking the chaos and controversy around South Africa's VAT hike, or rather, the halting thereof. The finance minister, alongside various smaller party leaders, made a big show of pausing the increase, but the DA wasn't buying it, and over the weekend they went back to court filing supplementary papers. So, what gives? We're also looking at the legislation tied to this fiscal move with the so-called fiscal framework, plus two key bills that quietly shape how the state spends and borrows. With the court hitting pause on the VAT, what happens to these bills? And with still a budget shortfall looming, where is the money coming from? We'll touch on the expanded zero-rated basket of essential goods too, and will that survive the VAT reversal? Or will it be next on the chopping block? So, has the public really won? Or are we just trading one pain point for another? Helping us make sense of it all is someone who knows policy from the inside. And joining me to break it all down is Tara Roos, a sharp young policy mind inside Parliament as a researcher for various portfolio committees, a founder of the Participation Project, and So We Vote on Instagram, former UNESCO Youth Ambassador, and someone who's really had a seat at the table of not just local, but global policy making. She's not here for the spin, just straight talk. So strap in as we level up. So, Tara, on to it, right? So much is happening so quickly, and you're right there in the heat of it all. So, big announcement last week, Thursday, big announcement. All the small parties, everybody is getting their 2 cents worth of what it is that they signed on, and quite a big hoo-ha that the minister makes about halting the VAT increase. And then over the weekend, the DA submits supplementary documents to court. And I thought, whoa, what's going on? So, and court came back, obviously, on Monday, we now know, and has actually ruled that the VAT increase must be halted. Explain to me, like most South Africans who don't work in Parliament, what in the actual is happening? What does all of this mean?
Okay, so this entire debacle, if South Africans can remember, we need to take it back to the 19th of February when the budget speech was initially delayed. And that was because the Minister of Finance wanted to table a 2% VAT increase. The Democratic Alliance said, no, we cannot stand with this. We need to rework the budget. Okay, there was a delay, all good and well. 2.5 weeks later, we come back to Parliament. And about 15 minutes before Parliament sits, John Steenhuisen tweets out, we as the Democratic Alliance cannot support this 2.0 budget in its form. And we then, once the budget is tabled, there's going to be a 0.5% increase. So
percentage point.
Percentage point
as well. Yeah. Okay.
This is also a math thing. So what a lot of South Africans need to understand is that while there is one budget speech, there isn't one budget. So the budget is made out of 3 documents. So first you have the fiscal framework, and then we have the appropriations bill, and then the division of revenue. So the fiscal framework gets passed first, and it's not a bill, but it lays the foundation for the appropriations bill and the division of revenue. So fiscal framework is made out of estimate revenue and expenditure. So how much money are we as the government going to make through taxes and where we get interest on things and our imports and our exports, and how much are we going to spend? How much are we going to spend to the various government departments on certain social programs? So it's all estimates, and that is where the VAT increase lies. Being in the Standing Committee of Finance. So this is where the infamous Action SA recommendation happens. So before the fiscal framework, before the fiscal framework that was, I think to this day, Action SA they still don't know what they did in that committee meeting room, because before the fiscal framework can go to the National Assembly, it needs to go through the Standing Committee. And so Action SA had the deciding vote, because the IFP and the ANC were going to vote to approve the fiscal framework, and every other political party, MK, the EFF, and the DA, were all going to vote no. And so Action SA had the deciding vote in that committee room, and what they had stated is that they made a recommendation to National Treasury that VAT should then be reversed within 30 days, and therefore they are voting, they called it a conditional vote. They're conditionally voting yes, so that they can pass the fiscal framework, and so the National Treasury could bring the VAT down. So there were many flaws in Action SA's logic, but nonetheless, it went through the standing committee, it then went to the National Assembly floor, and we saw the fiscal framework pass with the help of three key parties, Rise Mzansi, Build One South Africa, and Action SA. Because within the GNU, the Freedom Front Plus and the Democratic Alliance did not vote for the adoption of the fiscal framework, and so the ANC had just made it by getting support from those three political parties. So the fiscal framework passed, and that was indefinitely going to increase. You had the smaller political parties come out and say, no, they had only voted to pass the fiscal framework because it was conditional. They are going to bring that down subsequently now that the fiscal framework has been passed. And technically speaking, they could have done that. So if the DA's court case didn't go through up until what we had found out last week, Saturday, what needed to have happened for the VAT increase to be passed was that we were going to need to make an amendment to the Rates and Monetary Amounts Amendment Revenue Bill. So we call it colloquially the Rates Bill, but that is where the VAT increase lies. And so if we were going to have the VAT increase be stopped, the Minister of Finance would have needed to make an amendment to the Rates and Monetary Amounts and Amendments of Revenues Bill, and that would have then need to be proposed. It would have then need to have gone through committee review in the Standing Committee of Finance, and it then would have need to been debated in the National Assembly and then the National Council of Provinces, and then the president would have need to have signed it all in the space of about a week. So that was really
because it was 3 days that was available,
yes.
Right?
So what had happened was we voted on the fiscal framework. Parliament then went on parliamentary recess, and so it's almost like a parliamentary break. Then it was constituency week. So for about 2 weeks, the MPs weren't in Parliament. There had been ad hoc discussions with the various political parties. We saw a lot of things flying around on social media. A lot of people gave speeches. But for about a 2-week period, MPs weren't in Parliament. So the Standing Committee of Finance couldn't have met. There couldn't have been any amendments. They could have called an emergency seating of the National Assembly and the NCOP and halted that process along, but that just didn't happen. So up until last week, that was going to increase on the 1st of May, because something that we also have to remember is that the Rates and Monetary Amounts and Amendment of Revenue Laws Bill, it is only proactive. It's not retroactive. So once signed, then that would have been halted. But hypothetically speaking, had that only have happened on the 12th of May, that would have still have increased for the first 14 days before, or however many days before that.
Because so I didn't get a single SMS or email from anyone telling me that the VAT is stopped or scrapped until Monday, when court came back with their court order.
So that's the thing, is that VAT was going to increase, and a lot of political parties were kind of championing this message that we're going to bring it down, we're going to bring it down. A lot of people were saying, okay, but when? The time, you're running out of time. And a big argument that was coming up from the smaller parties was that they had to vote for the fiscal framework because we can't have a country operate without a budget. And that is just not true. It's illogical. So constitutionally
what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
So constitutionally speaking, we have something called the PFMA, so the Public Finance Management Act. And Section 29 of the PFMA aligns that if a budget is not passed by the start of the new financial year, the country can operate on 45% of its extended budget for the country to operate, right? Because it's not, so a lot of the small political parties were kind of championing this idea that we had to vote for the fiscal framework and we made the hard decision for South Africa because you can't have a country without a budget, but that's just not true. And so it was a lot of political spinning. I feel really sorry for all the communications directors for these various political parties because they were trying to spin the narrative any which way. And they thought they had the win come last week, Thursday, when there had been this announcement that all the political parties who had signed the fiscal framework were going to meet, and they were holding this press conference in Joburg, and they had announced that VAT was going to be decreased. So a few hours before that, the Minister of Finance had formally stated for the first time, because up until this point, despite the small political parties saying that they had given conditional votes for the fiscal framework to be passed, in order for that to be brought down. The Minister of Finance and the ANC had said nothing of the sort. And so up until that
They got
memo,
hooked.
yes, and that was the large narrative, is that they had been played. But up until that memo had come out and the Minister of Finance had said, you know what, actually, we are going to halt the VAT increase. And he put out that like press statement at something ridiculous, like 20 to 1 in the morning, because he was hoping that no one was going to look at it. And they had the press conference the next day, and it really became like a DA bashing session. All the small political parties had come out and they had said, you know what, we didn't jump to court, we brought the VAT increase down. And they had really scored an own goal way too early in the game. Because while the Minister of Finance had now clearly instated his intentions for that to be brought down, those legislative processes still had to happen up until May 1st.
Yes.
And so they were running out of time. People were looking every which way to say, okay, because now currently it's parliamentary leave, which is very different from parliamentary recess. Yes, there are many different periods. So this week it's currently parliamentary
leave.
Everybody
wants a parliamentary job.
It's currently parliamentary leave. So the question was, if Parliament's only supposed to reconvene after the 1st of May, how are you going to bring that down? They hadn't made any announcements that they were going to declare an emergency National Assembly meeting. They hadn't discussed how this was going to work.
Because Parliament has a calendar, and the Speaker will have to schedule this into the system.
And so all that memo indicated was a formalization of what the smaller parties had already been saying that was going to happen. Cut to Sunday, the DA's court case. And the DA really, yes, their supplementary affidavit, they really have come out on top of this entire saga, because initially when the Minister of Finance had declared that no, they were going to bring the VAT increase down, like every political party had come out, from MK to the EFF to the DA to every political party in the GNU. Everyone had claimed that this was their victory, that it was their political campaigning, that they made the right decision and they are the reason that VAT has come down. Unequivocally, factually speaking, the only people, and I know a lot of South Africans wouldn't like to thank the DA, but the only political party you can thank right now, as of this moment, for VAT not being increased on the 1st of May is the Democratic Alliance, because of their court case. So legislatively speaking, while all the political parties that had voted for the fiscal framework, all, like the DA, had the intention they didn't want that to increase, that wasn't going to happen on the 1st of May had the DA's court case, and subsequently the EFF had also signed onto it, had that court case not gone through, because we would have still had to gone through all those legislative processes. But I do think the court finding was really interesting. And if you listen to the ruling, and I thought it was so funny, because Action SA, for like this long time, it did like, you'll wait and see. And even when they announced that VAT was going to be decreased, there was a lot of campaigning to say, we are really just like the political party of the budget. Like, we understand this like no one else did. And the judge in her ruling had stated, like, Action SA's recommendation was not legally binding. That was never going to decrease under this recommendation. And that is what, like, we as like policymakers and like researchers have been saying for the longest time ever. It's like, we don't know who at Action SA thought this was a good idea. I don't know who the researchers are who thought that they should implement this, because, and this is a big issue.
Yeah. Tara, I need us to do a bit of a bill breakdown.
Yeah.
Because I want to understand these two other instruments, the appropriations bill. So let's start with that one. Let's start with the appropriations bill and what that means and why they have to be tabled simultaneously with the fiscal. And then we'll talk about the rates bill.
Okay. So there are the two key finance bills are the appropriations bill and the division of revenue. So appropriations is how money is allocated to the various government departments. So how much is education going to get? How much is DPWI going to get? And what are the purposes and the various projects for that department? So that is the extent of that bill. And then there's the division of revenue. So that outlines how much money is going to national government, provincial government, and local government. And that really has to do with public services. So the reason why these two bills now need to be retabled is because they are configured on the basis of the fiscal framework, which is configured on estimates from National Treasury, which takes into account the VAT increase. And so currently, initially, when there were a lot of discussions about whether or not that was going to be reversed. We were going to be in a budget deficit and a shortfall. And initially the shortfall was only supposed to be 30 billion. But in the Minister of Finance statement, when he announced that that was going to be decreased, it's actually 75 billion.
70 billion. 75
million. Like, that is a lot of money that is now needed to be made up because of that not being increased. And so those two bills also need to be withdrawn. And what we are likely going to see is a large amount of cuts going into various social services programs, into various government departments. DPWI, like every road project in this country is most likely going to be, not every, that's a bit extensive, but a lot of the road projects are likely going to be cut. There's going to be a lot of department cuts. And so we're just really sitting and waiting to see what National Treasury is going to give us for Budget 3.0. That's coming.
Okay, so let's talk about where the 75 billion is likely to come from. Because what the tabling of a new fiscal framework and the subsequent appropriations, as well as division of revenue bill, it means that the money must come from somewhere.
Yeah,
it's not coming from VAT. It must come from somewhere. And two of the things that the minister, when he initially tabled his fiscal framework, spoke about was increasing that zero VAT rated basket. Yeah. He spoke about increasing, as they do every year, social grants. I mean, I know when you think about it, at 35 rand per person, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it is actually a lot of money. It's almost 50 million that it would come to. So if you thought there was a lot of politicking and a lot of kind of showboating about who is the champion of South Africans, it's about to get worse, because cuts, where else can the money come from?
So this is also another big politicking issue that we saw with small political parties who had all made recommendations to the Minister of Finance to say, we gave you this conditional vote to pass the fiscal framework. This is how we think we should raise money. So right now, National Treasury is estimating there's going to be a 75 billion rand shortfall. And no political party has come up with sufficient measures that does not include taking out a new loan to raise money within itself or to find that money elsewhere within government. So government National Treasury rather, has three main ways to get money. They could either cut, and this is most likely what's going to happen. They could tax. They tried that and that didn't work. Or we could take out a loan. And those are really the only three options that National Treasury has to get revenue or the country as a whole to operate. The issue with spending cuts, I know there's been a large conversation about, we should cut deputy ministers. There's a lot of departments that have 2 deputy ministers. In a department, there's about 11, 12 DGs. Well, there's one DG, but about 12 DDGs. Every DG has a chief of staff who has a spokesperson, who has a this, who has a that. And there is a lot of bureaucracy. But the highest estimate that we've seen now, I stand to be correct on this, but I think Build One South Africa had said that they could, when reconfiguring the kind of cutting of the cabinet and the bloat of the cabinet, we talk about like up to about 3 billion. Before that, it was only about 2 billion. So when we're talking about 3 billion in the context of 75 billion, like it's chump change. It quite frankly is. And so this is a big issue.
Every cent counts.
Every cent counts, but some cents count more than others. And so there's a lot of conversations about, we should cut security spending. I mean, just a few weeks ago, we saw the deputy president get shot at. You also have to understand the political context of South Africa. And so there's a lot of cuts.
In fairness, though.
Yes.
In fairness, though, they only got that when they got home. They only
noticed. They don't, and they only let the country know 3 weeks later.
We could cut that.
Yeah. But this brings into the question is that if these cuts were made readily available, why haven't we done that already? And the Minister of Finance, and I agree that I think a 2% VAT increase would have been extensive, but I do maintain that, and I know this is a largely unpopular opinion, but 0.5 percentage points, I think, objectively would have been the better alternative for South Africans in the short term. I do think that should have been brought down again, but I do not think that now we are realistically talking about other revenue measures Because the sad reality is that South Africa does not have enough taxpayers. We do not have enough taxpayers to support the economy, to support the country, and we are not at the projected growth. So ideally, when we're looking at our population rate, we should be at about 2% GDP growth. That is like the ideal minimum sweet spot. A lot of people will say 3%, 5%, but 2% is like the ideal, we're making it as a country. Right now, National Treasury is only projecting a 1.8% GDP growth for the next financial quarter. We're only
And that
currently
is
sitting
a
at
very
1.6%.
but also that is based on the National Treasury's projection.
Yeah.
And when you look at international benchmarking agencies and what they are projecting for us, Treasury is feeling very bullish, actually.
Yes, they are. And it's really, really concerning for ordinary South Africans because we are going to face this issue time and time again. Our economy is not growing. And I think that the Minister of Finance was dealt a very difficult job when he had to deliver the budget this year because on one end, we cannot cut social programs. And I don't think that we should. We've still kept around the COVID SRD grant following COVID-19 because South Africans are just in a much more worse socioeconomic situation than we were when they instituted the grant. We do have a large percentage of the population who are grant recipients, and unemployment is a sky-high problem in this country. So taking away 350 to people who desperately need that, like that is the difference between someone having a meal and someone not. But then alternatively, that is also a massive budgetary line item. I think grants as a whole cost about 38 billion. So that is a lot of money in the South African deficit. And so VAT was almost, especially with the 2% increase, but even VAT at the 0.5 percentage point increase, VAT was a way to tax poor South Africans without taxing poor South Africans. It was a way for the government to collect more revenue to try and plug the gap for South Africans who are not tax paying. And whether or not you think that was a good idea or not, it was their best idea to try and fix this deficit. We could look into spending cuts. I know a lot of political parties have also put out, cut down on the cabinet. They want to cut security. They want to cut diplomatic missions. There's a lot of cuts. But something that we also need to realize, and while there is a lot of bureaucracy that exists in government, especially in the executive branch of government, and I'm the first to note that, is that it takes a lot to run a country. There are more than it does. It takes a lot of people to run a country. There's more than 60 million people in South Africa. We are not Ireland or like some small, like Swedish Nordic country where there's only 2 million of us. You need
and look, and I agree. We need people to run government, but also we need efficiency. I think one of the things that's particularly galling for South Africans is to feel like you're paying and not getting a service that is equal to the amount that you are paying. It's kind of like you're willing to pay 15 Rand more for Woolworths milk versus Checkers milk because you, for whatever reason, feel Woolworths better quality or whatever it is. So you're willing to trade that off. But I mean, and I think one of the things that's particularly irritating for me as a South African is also hearing and watching all of these theatrics and nobody speaking about the real issue, because the real issues for me really do live in that space where we're not growing our economy sufficiently. We're not including enough people to have the highest unemployment rate in the world is actually bullshit. And to then say, oh, the people that are already paying tax, I'm going to tax them more, and VAT being the most egregious type, right? Because it actually disproportionately also affects poor people because everybody pays VAT. Everybody pays VAT, and it's a crazy and silly thing. But I'm also wondering, listening to you now, and the way that you've articulated it, is that this 0.5 percentage point not happening, is it really a win? Is it really a win for South Africans? Or is this just a kind of, it looks like a win on this side, but actually it's coming back to bite you in the ass either way?
From a fiscal standpoint, it's not a win. And I know that that is a harsh debate amongst many South Africans. And I think, that is a very tricky subject because it is a regressive tax. It will largely disproportionately affect those in the lower LSM of the country. And I mean, I hear a lot of your frustrations, and we hear it from a lot of South Africans to say, like, why must I continuously pay and not receive what I am paying for? When you look at, like, even when we look at the money that is going to local government and provincial government, I mean, over there in Joburg, you guys don't have water, you don't have electricity. Like, it's tough. It's a tough time. But the problem is that not enough South Africans are paying. And that is a harsh reality that I think a lot of people aren't ready to confront. I know that there's a lot of rhetoric being thrown around.
I think a lot of people, it's not they're not ready to confront it. They absolutely understand it. It's not like people are dodging tax. They are not working, therefore they can't pay tax. They're not dodging tax. I promise you, nothing irritates or kind of grates my tits as much as watching what's his name, Kisveta, have a press conference and talk about the unprecedented amounts that they have collected through SARS. And I'm like, it's not a great thing. When you've got such a small tax base, you're just squeezing those people more and more. And nobody is talking about the solution of saying, how do we grow the tax base by getting more people into the economy, rather than saying we're going to grow the tax base by taxing people more.
And that is a big problem. My understanding from the initial budget, the first draft of the budget, where we were going to have a 2% VAT increase, was that the basis for that was so that the grant system could fund itself, and so that the government could keep itself afloat without having to take more money out and putting the country into more debt, and try to figure out a manner and to grow the economy so that we could then eventually bring the VAT increase down. And a similar thing to happen now with budget draft 2.0. I hear a lot of South Africa's frustrations. I know a lot of South Africans also talk about like a wealth tax, looking at how do we increase corporate tax.
Well, that's one of their big. That's one of their big brainwaves. One of their big brainwaves is a wealth tax.
And the problem with looking at taxation methods like a wealth tax is, firstly, and I don't disagree, the ordinary middle class and like working class South Africans, we are squeezing them dry as a country because they do make up the majority of South Africa's current existing tax base. And they were going to be disproportionately affected by that. And when you look at what they, in return, the average middle class South African who is really going to get private health care, who is having their kids potentially in private schools, who are not really largely relying on government services, but then are paying for these government services to be implemented, there is a lot of frustration. But the issue with the wealth tax is that, unfortunately, and I do think that this is a large kind of disparity, is that there's this idea, and there is a massive disparity between the upper LSM and the lower LSM in South Africa. I don't dispute that at all. But
highest Gini coefficient in the world.
Yes, there, and it is extremely, extremely large. But we do not have, even if we look at the top one, like 0.1%, the manner in which you would need to structure fiscal mechanisms to tax those South Africans, unfortunately, is not going to happen under this current government. And I know that a lot of South Africans are saying that, there's many layers to it. I do think that there would need to be a complete overhaul of the Minister of Finance, how Treasury operates, how we are looking at fiscal policy. A lot of those people do make up ANC donors and big party donors as well. And they have a lot of skin in the game when it comes to that. And this is also another reason, is that a wealth tax is important and it's important for the conversation, but we do need to be looking at proactive measures that can be enacted now to get us out of this current scenario. A wealth tax 10, 15 years down the line, and this is not to say that we shouldn't stop championing for a wealth tax or really running the numbers to configure how we could be implemented, but the likelihood of that happening right here, right now, like, I'm so sorry to South Africans to break their hearts, it's not going to happen. And it's sad, but it's true. And that is a big issue, is that I think we're not talking about proactive measures that need to happen now in order for the economy to grow. And this is where I will come into the defense of Minister Godongwana, to say that a lot of South Africans have harshly been attacking him to say, why are you trying to tax us? The economy isn't growing. That isn't our fault. It isn't his fault either. It is not the Minister of Finance's job to grow the economy. It is the Cabinet's job. More specifically, we should be looking at Minister Parks Tau to say, why is the economy not growing? But it is Cabinet's job at large to make sure that the economy is growing and that we reach that minimum baseline 2% GDP growth. Unfortunately, and I know that we as South Africans have really become adopted to the mindset to think that, the government just doesn't work and they don't have our best interests at heart and they are just making a mess out of the budget and out of running the country. And there's so many issues going around.
But
and there is.
They're not.
They're not. And especially, and this is a big issue, is that I think it is really easy to look at everyday issues that are going around in local government that has very little to do oftentimes locally and provincially with what is going on nationally. There's a mess, but there's many messes, and not all messes belong to the people that we are currently directing our frustrations to, is essentially what I'm trying to tell South Africans. And so the big issue is that, looking at especially Budget 2.0 with the 0.5 percentage point increase, it is very largely unpopular, but it was a very small price to pay for what the potential long-term effects are now. We don't know where Treasury is going to get the money from. There are two kind of possibilities. Either we do massive spending cuts, which are going to largely affect developmental programs. So I mentioned earlier road programs. There's a large kind of overhaul with DPWI, especially, is going to face a lot of cuts. And we are going to ultimately have to take out a loan, most likely from the BRICS Bank. And the amount of money that we're currently paying towards debt servicing the costs, to me, I cannot make fiscal sense of it. Conversely, on the other end, another big talked about is getting money out of the GRFCA. So that is the Golden Foreign Exchange.
That's it. GRFCA. Please tell people what it is.
So again, I'm a fan of neither of these approaches. So the GRFCA is this account that lies within the Reserve Bank. So it is not a backup account. It's a shock absorption account. So it exists within twofold, within National Treasury and within the Reserve Bank. But the Reserve Bank uses it as a tool to account for currency fluctuations in order to maintain homeostasis of debt stabilization. So if you think about it, to break it down for South Africans, is that when the rand increases against the dollar, we make a profit. That then goes into the GRFCA. And when it falls against the dollar, we obviously make a loss. The GRFCA is there to make sure that we don't have there isn't hyperinflation and vast disparities in currency fluctuations. So it's a shock absorption account. So it is quite extensive and quite large. And what happened at the end of 2024 is that we were operating in a budget deficit, and the Minister of Finance wrote to the governor of the Reserve Bank and said, listen here, we need to get us to the next financial quarter. Could we please take some money out of the GRFCA? And we will then potentially pay it back. It's almost like a loan system. But what happened in November of 2024 was that a particular man became president of the United States of America. And tariffs are the name and aim of the game. And when we look at the vast fluctuations that are happening with the rand to the dollar and where it's currently sitting, I do not think that it is fiscally wise to take money out of the GRFCA. I do think I draw a very staunch line to say that the bank should be separate from the state and the two shouldn't be coexisting. I think that the governor of the Reserve Bank has been doing a really good job currently when we're looking at whether or not we're going to increase the repo rate, decrease the repo rate. He's made some really wise monetary decisions. And I hope this is not the case, but that the political pressure of what is happening fiscally is going to influence what is going to happen monetarily, because that is just going to create a further mess than what we're currently seeing.
What's the second route?
The second route is that we cut a lot of developmental programs. Cutting grants is not going to be an option. I have seen a lot of discourse about whether or not that should be a conversation. I think that it is completely illogical to cut the 359 SRD grant because they are very, yes, there are instances of people who abuse the system, and I don't disregard that at all. But the idea that South Africans at large are going and waiting in line to go and collect 350 rand from the government, it's completely illogical. People are collecting that because they absolutely need that. And that is the difference between their kids eating tonight and their kids not. Does there need to be an overhaul of the system to make sure that it is being used productively and that there aren't people who are kind of corrupting the system and collecting the money even though they have a job? Absolutely. And I'm sure that will save us maybe a couple of 10 million. But at large, I don't think that we should be cutting grants. The main thing that we need to be looking at now is how do we grow the economy and how do the ministers plan to grow the economy? And that is what I really want to see. I do think that the Minister of Finance, he's been in the media a lot recently, but how, or you know what I would love is I would love for a mass press conference of the entire cabinet and everyone needs to come up. Each minister must come up and they're going to say, this is how much money we are going to get as allocated to us by the appropriations bill. This is what we are going to spend it on, and this is how we are going to grow jobs.
This is going to be the return on that investment.
Yes, this is the return on their investment. I do think that, you know, even within certain government departments, they'll get to the end of the financial year and they will have large sums of money that haven't been spent into their department.
Well, this is also a chronic problem that we have, right? As we often have, come February, we have many departments sending money back to Treasury because they haven't spent the money that they were allocated. So this is a chronic problem that we have, and maybe it is also partly about relooking how that money is then divided, you know, the division of that money as well. Maybe there's too much like cheerful budgeting in the departments themselves where they're saying, oh, I need X amount, which they actually don't need that X amount. But I want to ask you about the work that must happen now. You know, you sit inside the belly of the beast in terms of the work that happens getting ready to table those bills. How easy is it to turn this around? So how long will it take? And what are the impacts between now and then? Because obviously people have to go back to the drawing board and they have to rethink how everything was calibrated and how they're going to do that going forward. So how long, how much work goes into this, and what impact will that have on South Africa?
So the new parliamentary schedule is actually just released today. We got it today. So we're looking at this entire budget saga only wrapping up in July. For all bills to be passed, we're fingers crossed July. let me not be too optimistic. So the new budget will be tabled within the next 2 weeks. From that, the new fiscal framework will be redrawn, and then the new appropriations bill, and then the new division of revenue, and we will need to start the cycle all over again. So fiscal framework will go to the standing committee, then be voted on by the National Assembly, then the NCOP, and then we'll take it like that with every bill. And the reason why this process, we're now going to have to restart and be so extensive, ultimately it really is dependent on what national treasury and where they are going to get the money from. There is a reality in which we do not recuperate that 75 billion. And I understand what you're saying. There are various departments who, and National Treasury has largely operated this model of that they would rather overestimate than underestimate. Because what you don't want ultimately is a country operating in a budget deficit. And we have operated in a budget deficit before. But when you operate and you equate for a budget deficit, the chances that we are going to have to increase borrowing, it's 100% likely. And it is not good for South Africans right now, for the government needing to take out more loans, because that is going to in turn increase national debt, but it is always going to lead to increasing of higher interest rates. And that is what we don't want. We are not at, I know there are many alarmists, we are not at the point of we are going to reach hyperinflation just yet. No need to sound the alarm bells, but we do need to look at economic stability overall, and most importantly, investor confidence. I know that there are many political parties, especially those who are economically on the left, who say we shouldn't care about investor confidence. Unfortunately, it's a free market economy in this country, and we need to. And so South Africans' fiscal standing globally has taken a massive knock with this budget impasse. When we are going to look like later into the year when ratings agencies are going to rate South Africa, it is 1,000% going to affect where we stand from an investor confidence point of view. The economists of the big banks are all currently sitting, drafting up their memos, waiting for the new budget to come out so that they can thoroughly investigate it. So South Africans will only really see an end to the saga come July. The big question about whether or not this was the right decision, from a political perspective, it is a massive win for the DA. Action SA, unfortunately, they are the biggest losers in this current scenario. But
Action SA not as so you think Action SA are the biggest loser and not the ANC having scored this own goal?
No, because the ANC still gets to keep the GNU. And that is the big question, is that the ANC, the government still stands. You know what? The thing is, I think the ANC has really started to grapple with the fact that they are unpopular among South Africans. And that reality hasn't changed with the GNU being established, is that there is large contestation. The ANC's base will always be the ANC's base. Why I think Action SA has lost vast amounts of credibility is because they claimed a media win before it was a legislative win. And you've seen that with a lot of small parties, is that they're making these bold claims in the media and they're trying to politic for like short span attention in the moment. But legislatively, is that going to transfer into votes? I don't think so. And I don't think that there is a kind of basis for that. When you look, and especially when you look at Action SA, who made the intentional choice not to join the government of national unity, they're now competing in the opposition space with bigger players like MK and the EFF. And they are only there with their 1.2% and their 6 MPs in parliament, and they're trying to make a name for themselves. And I do think that they hastily signed that recommendation and chose the side of the ANC in a hopes that the GNU was going to fall apart and they could have made themselves kingmakers. But kingmakers very rarely become kings. And the ANC isn't the biggest loser because they get to keep the GNU. And that is what the ANC wanted.
So I know this is a slightly left of center question for you because it's not necessarily about the bills, but it is about the impact of the saga on the politics of it.
Yeah.
So the MK party, which is the official opposition now in the face of the DA ANC Grand Coalition, didn't even get all of their people there to vote. So they did not even get all of their people there to vote initially with the fiscal framework, and now they are claiming a victory. How do you think that looks for them?
So, you know, MK as a party, they're a new political party, and it is very evidently so. I always renege that I think it is quite funny that they are the party calling for parliamentary supremacy when they don't have all their seats filled in parliament. And so that is because of a parliamentary rules that initially when MK came in, they were rotating their seats. And so you are allowed to rotate the amount of seats that you get. They have 58 seats in parliament. You are allowed to rotate which person occupies that seat in parliament, but they had done it too quickly. So only now at the end of May are they going to be able to fill their seats fully to make sure that they reach their full MP count. Quota. And so they reached their full quota. So they didn't have all their MPs seated in parliament when they voted on the fiscal framework. Ironically, they also didn't have the parliamentary leader of their political party. Dr. John Klope was notably missing.
Oh, I did not know that.
From the date of the fiscal framework voting. And so, you know, this is also the other question is, where is the opposition? The DA had played the opposition game very well. And I think they're kind of stuck at an impasse now. They're trying to play opposition politics while being in government. They took their coalition partner to court. Thankfully, it worked out for them. But had they had lost that court case, we would be having a completely different conversation now. And so I do think Action SA is trying to kind of fill the gap. The EFF is really still trying to find their feet after notable MP losses and where they fit into the kind of larger political landscape now with MK in the picture. And so now we really have Action SA trying to carve out this space for themselves. But I do think a fundamental issue, and I think this is just a larger politicking problem, is that Action SA and the DA do not like each other. And I think that is extremely evident. But I do think both political parties are letting their internal hatred for each other misguide their legislative and political decisions.
Bona, that tea is hot. And,
No,
and, and nobody wants to have that hot tea. Maybe maybe we need to have this conversation about that hot tea. Because that is true. That is true. And it's and well-known factors of
Yeah.
what could be the source of this hatred. And yet it's it's like it almost feels like, when you were little at home and they'd say, those are like big people's things. You mustn't be
Yeah.
part of those conversations. That's what it feels like. But watching the DA, unlikely partnership, the EFF and the DA together as part of this court case was also an interesting thing to see. Do you think that signals a little bit of a maturity on the side of the EFF in who they are willing to get into bed with to reach their motives? They may not be the same, but the outcome is the same, but the place from which they depart is not the same. Which was also interesting watching over the weekend, the little press conference. I wasn't sure if it was a
Yes,
press conference or if it was an internal briefing that was happening there at Winnie Mandela House with the EFF leader, Mr. Julius Malema, saying, "We will vote with the DA in a no vote of no confidence." And I was like, "Oh well, what do you think
Yeah.
that means?"
So the idea is that a common enemy unites all. But the thing is, fundamentally, the DA and the EFF were against VAT for
Our
two complete
enemies. Are they the Youth Doomsday Coalition? For
They
the
were,
ANC?
yeah. So, I mean, I do think Julius Malema's comments were really interesting. He had said, if the DA had to bring a motion of no confidence against the president, we would vote with them. But when it came time to elect a new president, we would abstain. And that generates a very key issue. And so this is another thing, and a conversation that I think a lot of people, especially internally in the DA, are not ready to have, is that the DA wasn't, while they were very strong hardline against a 2% VAT increase, they were okay with 0.5 percentage point increase. But the issue is that the DA, and this is also just the way that the cookie crumbles sometimes, because the DA was willing to renege and vote with the ANC on a 0.5 percentage point increase had the ANC made policy concessions on other GNU specific issues, because the DA couldn't afford another loss. And they're really thankful that the courts ruled in their favor this time and they had won the game this time. But we, again, could have been having a very different conversation, because it would have been another loss. And then the conversation would have been, are they going to lead the GNU? Because Billa, NHI, land expropriation, and now VAT. And I think the DA made an initial mistake in the beginning, especially after the 19th of February, when their first speech wasn't tabled, to say, we are against a VAT increase, we are against a VAT bill. And they actually made that the center issue when it was not. And I do think from a fiscal point of view, the DA would have been okay with a 0.5 percentage increase had the ANC made other concessions. But they made this a hard line because nothing else had been a hard line for them before. And if they had not won this court case, they would have been the biggest losers.
Well,
because then
they
would have won. They took a
big
massive,
risk and it's paid out.
and it's paid off.
And finally, you work there every day. You wake up and you go to work in Parliament every day. How does this kind of upheaval impact the people working there on a daily basis? Does this now mean that y'all are going to be working overtime for the next 2 months to get all of this?
We often look at political leaders and, high powerful political figures and political parties like the spokesperson. But what is keeping the engine of politics in this country alive is staffers. It is the ordinary people who work in comms and admin and research. And they are really the people who is keeping this country going. And no one is sleeping. I can attest to the fact that when the Minister of Finance dropped that memo at like something to 1 a.m, we were all awake. It was
Somebody
being
has to drop it at 1.
It was all being sent to even the night before, like the day before they had that press conference with all the political parties, like no one was asleep. Everyone was awake. Political leaders love to drop pertinent news in the middle of the night. And so no one sleeps. I do think that there is, and I say this, and this is a very biased opinion, and I've said it often, I do think that Parliament is the most efficient organ of the state in the way in which it runs and the manner in which it governs. I think that there's a lot of, oftentimes, people confuse what Parliament does with what the executive branch of government does. I can never speak for exec, but Parliament runs really well in terms of oversight. And I do think in terms of getting the bills passed, if we can move the politics aside, come July, all the two main finance bills will be passed and the country can kind of move past this. But politics has entered Parliament in a way that it has never before, especially with the configuration of the GNU and smaller political parties all vying for attention and to contest in this space. And I do not think that this is the last we are going to see of not even just a budget impasse, but a bill impasse. What is going to be the next issue down the line where we almost overhaul and reconfigure what we are discussing and doing on a day-to-day basis in order to make way and for the political decisions that should have been, and this is another thing, is that the GNU has a statement of intent, is that the ANC directly went against the statement of intent, and so did the DA. And
as
they do
now
need
know, the statement of intent is non-binding.
Yeah, and it means absolutely nothing. So it's, how do these political decisions made outside of Parliament actually affect the legislative work that is going on? And, you know, the 7th administration, this is just the start of many more dramas that are yet to unfold.
Jesus, we are just 1 year in the 7th administration, and we are 100 days into a Donald Trump administration. It's gonna be bumpy, guys. It's gonna be a bumpy couple of years. And Tara, you have been an absolute vision. Thank you so much. I now have a much clearer understanding of all of these intricacies. And thank you for being so eloquent in the way that you described it for us. And I hope that even for the listener at home, they get it a little bit more and also feel like, you know, I feel like you have definitely come on this show and helped us kind of fill it up in a way. And we're going to call you back to break down more bills. I really think so. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Cool.